Hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're exploring the Vietnam War and how the United States, despite its military dominance, ultimately lost the jungle battle. The Vietnam War, fought from 1955 to 1975, was one of the most grueling and controversial conflicts in modern history. At first glance, the U.S. seemed poised for a quick victory. With advanced aircraft, tanks, weapons, and financial power, it appeared that a smaller nation like North Vietnam would not be able to sustain prolonged resistance. But the reality on the ground told a different story. Vietnam's dense jungles, mountainous terrain, and treacherous climate shaped the nature of the war into something the U.S. was unprepared to fight. The exterior environment of the Vietnam War was unforgiving and difficult to navigate. Unlike the flat plains of Europe or the deserts of the Middle East, the Vietnamese landscape was covered in thick jungle, marshes, and narrow trails. The humidity was extreme, diseases like malaria spread rapidly, and movement was often limited to footpaths or by helicopter. American tanks and trucks were almost useless in such terrain. Helicopters became the primary mode of transport for U.S. forces, but even those were limited in their ability to penetrate the dense canopy. The terrain heavily favored the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, who used their deep knowledge of the land to create elaborate tunnel networks and booby traps. The jungle wasn't just a background to the war, it was an active participant, hiding the enemy and punishing the unprepared. Inside the daily life of U.S. troops, the situation was equally challenging. Soldiers faced confusion, low morale, and lack of clear mission objectives. The rotation system meant that soldiers served only a year in Vietnam before being sent home, which disrupted unit cohesion. Unlike in previous wars, the enemy didn't wear uniforms or fight from a distance. They looked like civilians, used local villages for shelter, and struck quickly before disappearing. American troops often didn't know who they were fighting or why they were there. Meanwhile, Vietnamese fighters had a strong ideological drive and a deep-rooted commitment to independence and reunification. They believed they were fighting for their homeland, and that made them resilient in ways that American soldiers, many of whom were drafted, couldn't match. In terms of performance, the U.S. military had all the advantages on paper. They controlled the air, had more firepower, and greater logistical support. They dropped millions of tons of bombs, used napalm to burn through the jungle, and sprayed Agent Orange to destroy vegetation and expose enemy positions. Yet, despite all this, they failed to stop the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese from moving, regrouping, and launching attacks. The guerrilla tactics used by the Vietnamese forces were effective against a conventional military. They avoided direct confrontations, ambushed patrols, and used hit-and-run strategies that wore down American troops over time. The U.S. could win every major battle, but still lose control of the countryside and fail to break the enemy's will. Safety in Vietnam was almost non-existent for both sides, but particularly for American soldiers unfamiliar with the environment. Booby traps, landmines, punji pits, and sniper attacks turned every patrol into a gamble. Helicopters, while essential, were frequently shot down by anti-aircraft fire or crashed in difficult terrain. Protective gear helped little against hidden dangers and tropical diseases. On the other hand, the Vietnamese forces used underground tunnel systems to hide, escape, and survive bombings. These tunnels included hospitals, weapons storage, and living quarters. While not luxurious, they provided relative safety and flexibility, allowing fighters to disappear underground and strike again elsewhere. What made the Vietnam War different from previous conflicts was the unique nature of the fighting and the political consequences back home. It wasn't just a war of weapons, but a war of ideology, culture, and perception. The Viet Cong operated in small units, struck at night, and relied on local support. The U.S. military, used to clear enemies' invisible victories, was constantly chasing shadows. Media coverage played a major role. For the first time, images of combat, civilian casualties, and wounded soldiers were broadcast into American living rooms every night. This eroded public support and increased pressure on political leaders. Protest movements grew, especially among young Americans, many of whom faced the draft and questioned the purpose of the war. Morale at home declined alongside morale in the field. The cost of the Vietnam War was enormous. The U.S. spent over $140 billion on the conflict, not including the long-term care for veterans or the damage done to U.S. prestige and unity. More than 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands were wounded, both physically and mentally. The Vietnamese people suffered even more, with millions of civilians killed or displaced, cities destroyed, and lasting effects from chemical warfare that still impact generations today. The destruction of Vietnam's landscape and economy was catastrophic, and the scars of war remain visible. In the end, the U.S. lost not because it lacked strength or resources, but because it misunderstood the nature of the war it was fighting. The jungle, the people, and the strategy all resisted conventional approaches. The Viet Cong didn't need to win battles, they only needed to survive and make the cost too high for the U.S. to continue. America entered Vietnam confident in its power but left humbled by the limits of technology and firepower in the face of determined resistance and complex terrain. The Vietnam War remains a powerful lesson in the importance of understanding the environment, the enemy, and the hearts and minds of people.